My name is Grace Sullivan. I'm 34 years old and a ceramic artist living in Asheville, North Carolina. And the day I realized I didn't truly belong to my own family was the day they handed me leftovers on a paper plate. Everyone else had porcelain, matching dishes, real silver wine glasses clinking like we were celebrating something. Mine was soggy paper curled at the corners, and I was told not to sit at the table. Not the big one where the adults gathered or even the side table with the kids. Aunt Melanie just nodded toward a folding chair by the laundry room and said there's a spot there like she was offering me a favor. I sat. I smiled like it was fine. I told myself maybe it was just the stress of the day, maybe they'd remember I was my mother's daughter before the night was over. But no one did. No one asked me to join them, no one made room, and no one even looked my way. That night I didn't cry. I cleaned. I stood at the sink scrubbing that plate until the edges gave out. Not because it needed it, because I needed to do something with my hands that wasn't holding on to pain. It wasn't about the plate. It was about how easy it was for them to erase me, to seat me near the dryer like a distant cousin instead of the only child of the woman we were burying. The ache in my chest wasn't from grief alone. It was from the realization that I had been uninvited without anyone saying the words. And then Melanie did. She passed behind me, leaned in like she was giving me a kindness, and said softly, "You're not really family anymore, Grace. Why are you still here?" I didn't answer. I didn't argue. I just kept folding napkins and wiping down the counter like I was still trying to earn a place I already owned. Because it was still my home, I held the deed. I had repainted those walls, retiled the bathroom, pruned the lavender out back that Mom planted 20 years ago. I stayed because I believed dignity meant endurance, that if I waited long enough, someone would remember me. But I was wrong. 3 weeks later, I learned they had filed legal papers behind my back, tried to claim rights to my house through forged documents and stretched out genealogy. When I confronted them, they barely blinked. Hudson said we were just making room. For who I asked. For what? That's when it hit me. They weren't just asking me to leave. They were writing a version of our history where I never existed. And I knew then. I wasn't staying quiet anymore. The funeral was held on a gray hillside just outside Asheville at a private family cemetery that sat like a crown above the valley. Everything about it felt staged. The white tent, the rows of black coats and expensive umbrellas, the quiet hum of grief as performance. I stood near the back beneath a sugar maple just outside the reach of the tent's shelter. My coat was thinner than I remembered. I didn't bring an umbrella. I hadn't expected to stand alone. The Malisters sat in perfectly arranged rows. Their shoes polished, their scarves coordinated, their expressions just solemn enough to appear touched, but not undone. They moved like a choir that had rehearsed sorrow. I wasn't offered a seat. I wasn't handed a program. I was barely acknowledged at all. Aunt Harriet gave me a nod from across the lawn, the kind you give to a former neighbor, not to your sister's only child. I tried not to stare. I tried to blend into the background like a stray shadow. I thought if I didn't ask for space, maybe someone would offer it. They didn't. The eulogy was given by Uncle Raymond. He called my mother strong, graceful, the heart of the family. He talked about her love for tradition, her loyalty, how much she had given to the Malister name. He never once said she had a daughter. I stood there, heart-pounding hands clenched in my coat pockets, waiting for a mention, a nod, anything. It never came. No one cried. Not really. There were dabs at eyes with linen handkerchiefs perfectly timed size. It felt less like mourning and more like a play where no one wanted to miss their cue. After the service, I stepped forward, not to speak, just to place a small ceramic flower I'd made at the base of her headstone. Aunt Harriet intercepted me before I reached it. She smiled soft and sharp at the same time and said the family section is full, Grace. Maybe place it by the bench instead. Her hand rested lightly on my arm like she was correcting a child. I nodded. I turned. I walked away without protest. I placed the flower on the stone bench beside a pamphlet someone had left behind. My legs trembled. The grave marker had her full name, Eleanor Jean Malister, beloved sister, aunt, friend. There was no space for daughter, no mention of me. Later, as I walked past the catering table, Harriet leaned in again. Her voice was soft, almost kind. "Grace, I think it's time you accepted that you're not really part of this anymore." She didn't wait for a response. She turned and joined a cluster of cousins laughing near the heaters. I stood in the middle of the lawn holding a cup of cold coffee I hadn't meant to take, feeling like a ghost. I tried to breathe through it, tried to remind myself that grief makes people strange, that maybe they were just protecting their version of the story, but it was clear I wasn't in it. My mother's world had been neatly folded up and put away without me in it. All the years, the holidays, the birthdays we shared, they'd been erased. I left without saying goodbye. No one stopped me, no one noticed. The last thing I saw was a wreath placed beside her stone. A card tucked into it read, "From all of us with love, except Grace." I recognized the handwriting. I didn't need to guess who wrote it. And I didn't cry, not then. But something inside me cracked wide open, not just from grief, but from the cruel clarity of being forgotten on purpose. And that pain stayed with me all the way home. When I was around 10, my mom and I used to take drives through the North Hills on quiet Sunday afternoons. She always took the long way back from our hikes, winding through stretches of farmland and low rolling hills dotted with rust-red barns and wildflowers. There was one spot she always slowed down for. It wasn't much, just an old farmhouse with a sagging porch and a patch of land that caught the sun in a way that made it glow. She'd point at it, one hand on the steering wheel, the other brushing her hair back, and say, "If I ever win the lottery, Grace, I'm going to plant lavender right there." She said it every time like a promise. I didn't understand it fully then, but I nodded like I did. I think I just liked how certain she sounded. Sometimes we'd pull over and sit on the hood of the car sharing a lukewarm thermos of tea while she talked about rows of soft purple blooms. She said lavender smelled like calm, like everything was going to be okay even when it wasn't. I'd try to imagine it, the air thick with that sweet herbal scent, the breeze turning each stalk into a slow wave. She'd laugh and tell me I'd be the one to build the little roadside stand. I'd sell soap and candles and tea bags, and she'd bring me sandwiches from town. We never made plans past that. It didn't matter. That memory stayed soft in my chest like something I kept folded inside for bad days. It was never about the land, not really. It was about the way she dreamed out loud with me in the passenger seat. Back then, it felt like we were the only two people who saw it. A place that could be ours. A place not built on legacy or expectations, just peace. Years passed and we never talked about it again. Life got louder, she got sick, and that little hill slipped into the quiet parts of my mind. But even now, I can still see it. The cracked fence, the leaning mailbox, the sky just wide enough to feel like hope. The way she smiled when she said the word lavender, like she could already smell it. I drove out to the old farmhouse late one afternoon just to see if it was still there. The sky was heavy with early fall, all gold light and shadows that stretched long across the fields. The gravel road cracked under my tires like it remembered me. The place looked smaller than I remembered. The roof was slouched and the barn leaned to one side like it had grown tired of holding itself up. Weeds curled around the fence posts and an old hand pump stood guard near what used to be the well. I almost turned back. It felt like I was trespassing on something that had only ever lived in my memory. But I walked the edge of the property, letting my hands skim the tops of wild grasses, half listening to the wind. Near the well, something caught the sun. Just a flash of metal buried under dirt and moss. I bent down, brushed it with my sleeve, and froze. It was a plaque. Small bronze, weathered like it had been waiting there for years. 3 letters were carved into the surface. LR175. I didn't move. Couldn't. My knees sank into the dirt as the letters blurred behind a sudden sting in my eyes. My mother's initials, Lillian Rose Carrington, etched into the earth like a whisper she left behind. She had been here, not just in memory, not just in dreams. This land had held her too. The wind picked up and carried the faint scent of pine. I pressed my palm flat against the plaque, grounding myself in something real. Something hers. It wasn't a coincidence. It wasn't some sweet accident. She had claimed this place long before I knew to want it. No one else in the family ever spoke about this property. It had never shown up in any of the documents they fought over. It was hers, quietly, fiercely, fully hers. And now it was mine too. Not because someone handed it to me, not because it was part of a legacy, but because she had left a trace just deep enough for me to find. I moved into the cedar cabin in the late fall just as the mountain air began to bite. The place was crumbling in places, the wood dry and spotted with age, but it was mine. I carried in a single suitcase, my toolbox, and a small box of clay, my only possessions that mattered. Mornings began before sunrise when I would stoke the tiny stove and pour coffee into chipped mugs. I spent hours gathering firewood, stacking logs beside the door so I wouldn't wake in the cold. The silence pressed in around me, thick and unbroken by familiar voices or city noise. My pottery wheel lived in the back corner under a slanted roof, where light from a small window hit the spinning clay in golden strips at dusk. I shaped bowls and cups, each wobble and crack, teaching me something new about patience and imperfections. Most days, the pieces broke in the kiln or warped in the heat, but every now and then, something held together long enough to feel like progress. Loneliness grew heavy some nights when the wind moaned and the stove sputtered or failed. But I learned to sit with it, to let the emptiness echo rather than fill over with doubt. I would wrap a quilt around my shoulders, sit outside by moonlight, and let my hands rest in my lap while I tried to breathe beyond what I'd lost. I kept a notebook of small triumphs, a bowl that held water, a glaze that didn't crack, a pattern that looked like breathing. I named them quietly, like whispering claims to myself. These small signs mattered more than I expected. Then one crisp morning just after Thanksgiving, I found an email in the cluttered inbox I barely checked. It was an invitation from Blue Ridge Artists in Residence, a program I had admired but never thought to apply to. They said they came across my work online and wanted to offer a fall residency, no fee, no competition, just trust. I reread the message 3 times. My hands trembled the second time. It felt like a tentative hand extended through the silence. I walked outside into the fresh air and lifted my face toward the sky, letting the words settle in. My lungs filled with the scent of cedar and earth and something that might have felt like hope. I wondered if it was possible to feel both scared and grateful at the same time. Signing the paperwork felt surreal and final. I packed up my tools and some of my best pieces to bring into a shared studio nestled deeper in the woods. I had no idea what would happen next, but I felt something stir inside that I hadn't felt in years, a sense that I belonged somewhere. That first evening in the residency space, surrounded by unfinished clay and shared laughter over failed glazes, I realized something had shifted. I wasn't just ghosting through life, I was rebuilding it brick by brick, bowl by bowl. And somewhere between the kiln's glow and early morning coffee with new faces, I began to see a path forward. I didn't know what the future held, and I didn't need to yet. I only needed right now, this moment, when clay felt responsive and light, when my hands remembered strength, when my heart remembered how to hope again. And that was enough to keep going. It started with a knock on the cabin door late one Sunday afternoon. The sun was low, casting long golden shadows across the lavender rows I'd planted that spring. I was glazing mugs by the window and almost didn't hear it. When I opened the door, I saw Clara standing there with a practiced smile, 2 suitcases, and a windbreaker I hadn't seen in years. Behind her, Hudson climbed out of a black SUV, sunglasses, pushed up in his hair like he belonged there. My stomach dropped. They didn't ask if it was a good time. They just stepped inside. Clara complimented the smell of the place, the warmth the pottery laid out to dry. Hudson wandered off like he was inspecting property he'd just bought. I told myself to breathe. I made tea. I waited for a reason. Clara sat down and started talking about legacy, about healing, about what the Carrington family could build if we just started working together. She called it our farm. She smiled when she said we. She talked about family retreats, potential investors, a small vineyard that could go behind the studio if I would just trust the plan. I nodded politely and said nothing. That night, they stayed in town, but by the next morning, they were back with their bags and groceries and a request to stay in the guest cabin I hadn't finished renovating. I said it wasn't ready. Hudson said they didn't mind roughing it. I watched them settle in like it was theirs. Clara set up a laptop at my kitchen counter and made calls about business licenses and tax deductions. Hudson started building a deck behind the workshop without asking. They told the neighbors they were part of a creative collective. It got worse fast. I'd find Clara rearranging my finished work, saying the display needed a better story. Hudson told the pottery students I hosted that I was shy, not used to leadership. I heard them laugh in the evenings, glass clinking, as they planned a community launch event I hadn't agreed to. I started to disappear in my own space. I stopped firing new pieces. I avoided the studio. I slept badly. My hands shook. I told myself to confront them, but every time I opened my mouth, Clara would cut in with something soft and clever that made me feel childish. Then came the video. They posted it on the residency's alumni page, a beautifully edited clip titled The Carrington Revival. It showed shots of the cabin, the lavender field, the pottery shelves, slow pans over my face while I worked. But the voiceover was Clara's. She spoke about rediscovering family land, about honoring a matriarch's dream, about building a space for growth and art and healing. My name wasn't mentioned. It went viral. Local news called to interview her. People from town started stopping by asking if the place was open for weddings, events, retreats. I felt the ground tilt. That night, I locked myself in the bedroom. I curled on the floor with a pillow over my face and sobbed harder than I had in years. It wasn't just what they were taking, it was the way they were smiling while they did it. They hadn't come to reconnect. They had come to conquer, to rewrite what I had built into something that wore my mother's name but erased mine. And I knew then, they wouldn't stop unless I made them. I stopped waiting for them to apologize. One morning I woke up, looked around at everything I had built with my own hands, and felt a shift so deep I almost didn't recognize it. I was done being polite. I reached out to a lawyer named Janice Crowley, a local who knew about family property disputes and wasn't afraid of names like Carrington or Mallister. She met me over coffee. No pretense, just a notebook and clear eyes. I told her everything. We started quietly: paperwork, property records, proof of inheritance, dated titles, archived emails from my mother. Janice was meticulous. I had never felt more seen. Meanwhile, I kept up the appearance of peace. I smiled at Clara when she dropped off marketing ideas. I nodded when Hudson brought another contractor to look at the field. But I recorded everything. Every offhand comment, every meeting they hosted on my land, every moment where they claimed ownership in front of witnesses. Janice told me to be patient. That truth, once gathered, would speak louder than anything they could manufacture. The video they posted gave us leverage. It proved they had co-opted my likeness without consent. But what mattered more was the conversation they didn't think anyone heard. A week before the community launch, they planned I caught Clara on the phone saying the farm would be theirs by summer, that I was just the artist, not the brand. She laughed when she said it. That was the moment we decided to go public. I invited everyone to a gallery night at Carrington Clay, a fundraiser, I said, a celebration of legacy and local art. They came in droves: press friends, former students, neighbors who had watched the lavender bloom. Clara helped set up the chairs. Hudson tested the microphone. They had no idea what was coming. When the lights dimmed, I stepped onto the small platform in front of the studio. My hands were steady. My voice didn't shake. I thanked everyone for coming. I spoke about family, about dreams passed down, about the cost of silence. Then I hit play on the projector. The first video rolled Clara describing the farm as their family sanctuary. Hudson explaining how I was more of a creative partner than an owner. Faces in the crowd shifted. Then came the phone audio, Clara's voice, clear, sharp, undeniable, talking about taking over, saying my name like it was a placeholder. When it ended, the room was quiet, not a stunned silence, a knowing one. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't cry. I just looked out and said, "This land is mine." Not because I inherited it, but because I protected it. Because I bled into the soil and rebuilt what was broken. The applause started slow. Then it swelled like a wave I hadn't seen coming. Reporters came forward. Cameras clicked. Clara tried to speak. I held up my hand and said no more. By morning, the story was everywhere. A local artist exposes inheritance fraud. A stolen legacy reclaimed. The family retreated from the cabin by the end of the week. They left behind the mess, the broken fence, the unpaid contractors. But I stayed. I replanted what they trampled. I rewrote the story in my own words. And for the first time, it felt like the world finally heard me. The lawsuit ended quietly in a courtroom that smelled of dust and old ink. The judge ruled in my favor within minutes. Clear title, full ownership, no room left for arguments or appeal. They didn't look at me as they left. Hudson's face was pale and Clara clutched her purse like she was bracing for a wind that never came. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt still. Janice encouraged me to file a countersuit for damages. We had every right: the trespassing, the slander, the video. But I asked for something else instead: a signed agreement they would never return or claim association again. I didn't want their money. I wanted my peace. When the papers came in the mail, I read them once, then filed them away. I closed the gate to the driveway for the last time and planted 2 new lavender rows beside the studio. They bloomed early that year. Carrington Clay Commons grew into something I never imagined. What began as a whisper of survival became a sanctuary for others. We offered residencies, hosted workshops, and built a garden with benches where people could sit in silence and just breathe. I taught again. Not just technique, but how to trust your hands, how to stay soft in a world that asks for armor. My students came from cities and small towns. Some were grieving, some were starting over. I saw pieces of myself in all of them. The cabin changed too. It wasn't perfect. The floor still creaked, the pipes still groaned, but it felt like home. Not because it was mine, but because it was enough. Some mornings I sat on the porch with coffee and watched the mist roll over the fields. On those days, I didn't think about the hurt. I thought about the quiet. Forgiveness didn't come all at once. It arrived in pieces. In the way I stopped checking the mailbox for apology letters, in the way I no longer explained my side of the story to strangers, in the way I walked through my own land without flinching. I forgave them. Not because they deserved it, but because I needed room to grow something else. I couldn't carry the weight and still move forward. But I didn't forget. I remembered every time I taught a student how to center clay and they said they were scared to ruin it. I remembered when I placed their first finished bowl into their hands and saw that look, that knowing. I visited my mother's grave once a year, just me, a single lavender sprig, and whatever the air carried with it that day. I didn't bring flowers or speeches, just my presence. Last time I brought a small stone I had carved myself. It said 3 words, "You were right." Then I sat on the bench beside her and told her everything. About the kiln, the students, the late nights when I danced alone in the workshop, just to feel alive again. She would have smiled. She would have said it took me long enough. I left when the sun dipped behind the hill, the same hill we used to dream about planting. And I walked back to my truck knowing the story didn't end with what they took. It ended with what I made, and everything I had the courage to keep.